guess if you're on the West Coast, it's still good morning, but either way, welcome to the Anti-Money Laundering Training. My name is Steve Cook, and I'm going to be hosting the training today. If you're listening to this, if you signed on with your credentials that you received through email, your participation will be automatically recorded. If you're listening as a group, we just ask you to please, whoever the leader of that group is, if they would please, after the training is finished, that they'll send an email over to compliance. In the subject line, just put AML Training and today's date, and just list a roster of the people who are listening in with you on this call. This is a required training, and we do get audited every year, and part of that audit is they check to see if everyone has participated. So again, if you're in a group, please send us a roster of who's listening with you, and we'll have a record of that. There are specific things that we have to cover in this training. So if you've been in one of these before and you think you're hearing the same thing, it's because you are. You can just take those parts as your friendly reminder, annual friendly reminder. So with that said, let's get started. Anti-money laundering training. A little bit of legislative background. The Bank Secrecy Act. The Bank Secrecy Act was legislation that was passed in 1970. Its original intent was to combat money laundering and other financial crimes perpetrated by organized crime, aka the mafia. The BSA, as it's known also, is administered by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, also known as FinCEN, which is a bureau of the U.S. Department of Treasury. Over the years, as all things with government, the scope and the expanse of the BSA has grown. Most recently, the scope has grown to include, to be a great weapon against terrorism and in the money laundering aspect and the financial crimes that are committed and raising money for terrorism. And the scope has also grown, or the reach has also grown. In 2012, the BSA expanded the regulation to include non-depository residential mortgage lenders and originators. That means Mid-America Mortgage. So part of the BSA requires certain financial institutions to develop anti-money laundering programs and to report financial crimes. And those are the aspects that cover us here at Mid-America Mortgage. So let's take a look at this. We are to report crimes. What crimes are involved? Well, as the name would say, money laundering crimes are to be reported. Also financial crimes, financial fraud. But the BSA also stipulates that any suspicious transaction that is relevant to the possible violation of any law or regulation. So that covers just about everything. So basically, any crime that is committed or suspected to be being committed by, for, in, through, against Mid-America Mortgage by law needs to be reported to FinCEN by the reporting of a suspicious activities report. So we're going to look at, these crimes could be anything. They don't necessarily have to be mortgage fraud. Like I said, it says any type of crime. It could be if it's someone trying to fraudulently gain employment here, that would need to be reported to FinCEN. If somebody is suspected of embezzling funds inside the company, that would have to be reported to FinCEN. Say if the Russians are trying to hack our IT systems, and we suspect that, that would need to be reported to FinCEN. So basically, any crime needs to be reported. Let's take a look at some of these crimes. First one we mentioned was money laundering. What is money laundering? Money laundering is the process of making illegally gained proceeds, or also called dirty money, appear to be legal or clean. And we're going to look at that process. Money laundering process. The first thing criminals need to launder money is some money, and there's multiple ways that they gain their money, through drugs, through embezzlement, bribery, fraud, all kinds of different ways that criminals obtain large amounts of cash. But it doesn't do them very good to have a lot of cash if they can't use it. So the way that what they do in order to be able to use those funds is they launder the money. And it's basically a three-phase process. They don't really go sequentially all the time, and sometimes they bleed over, but there's basically three phases to the money laundering process. Then the first one is called placement. The goal here is to deposit criminal proceeds into the financial system. Get that money into the economy so that they can start cleaning it and the end result is so that they can use it. Placement. So say a drug dealer has $100,000 in cash proceeds and he wants to be able to use that for himself. The first thing he has to do is place that into the financial system. Now, if he just took the $100,000 and deposited it in his account, it wouldn't be long before the FBI showed up and had some words with him. So what he has to do is he has to place it in such a way that it doesn't draw suspicion to the origin of the money. And so what they do, they break it up into smaller pieces. Small enough pieces, they structure the deposit so that it doesn't draw attention to themselves. It doesn't fire off any reporting aspects from the bank. They'll break it up into smaller pieces. They'll deposit this piece in Bank A. They'll deposit this piece in Bank B. They'll make deposits over multiple days, spread it out. Sometimes they'll use currency exchange to exchange it to a different currency. They can exchange it into different denominations. If you're depositing $5,000 and it's all in 10s and 20s, that might look suspicious. So they'll exchange it for different denominations. Also involves transportation of cash, either over state lines or even into different countries that don't have the same regulations that we have in banking. But the whole idea, get the money into the financial system. And after they get it safely into the financial system, the second phase is called layering. And this is simply, they take the money and they move it around. They invest it, they disinvest it over and over again. And so they'll take the funds they deposited into Bank A, they will take it out, make a deposit into another bank. Let it sit there for a while, take it from the second bank, maybe wire transfer the money to an offshore account somewhere. Let it sit for a while. Bring it back later and then take that money, maybe buy a piece of property, sit on that property for a while, sell it. The whole idea here is to have layer after layer of investing and disinvesting. Every one of those transactions they're doing are perfectly legitimate. So the idea is to layer layers of legitimacy on top of the illegitimate origin of the money, so that if somebody tried to go back and follow the audit trail, it would be very hard for them to discover that the origin of this money is something that's illegitimate and illegal. That's called layering. Lots of, again, invest, disinvest, transfer, all these things, just leaving an audit trail, a big, messy audit trail, that if someone tries to follow it back, we have a very hard time finding the ultimate origin of those funds. That's called layering. The third phase is called integration, and this is the goal. The goal here is to use the proceeds for their personal benefit. They want to ultimately be able to use the money that they're gaining here. So they place the money, they layer the money, and once it's sufficiently layered and they think it's sufficiently hidden, the origin of it, then they can use it for their personal benefit. They can consume it however they want. They can buy cars, houses, boats, yachts, whatever they want to buy, or they can invest it in property. They can invest in businesses. But the point is they can now use the money without much fear of someone being able to trace that back to its true origin. The money is now integrated back in totally into the system and looks clean. So that's the process of money laundering. BSA also talks about financial crimes or financial fraud, and specifically for us, that would be mortgage fraud, Just want to take a few minutes and look at different types of mortgage fraud. First type of fraud is called fraud for property, also known as fraud for housing. It's motivated by a desire to get a marginal borrower into a house. And this type of fraud, it's all about the house. The kinds of fraud that are perpetrated for property could be income or asset fraud. The person, again, it's all about the person who may not qualify for a property and committing fraud in order to qualify for that property. It could be income or asset fraud. They're overinflating their income, or they're overinflating their assets in a way that they qualify where they wouldn't if they hadn't fraudulently inflated those assets. Employment fraud, that is, maybe they work somewhere and they only work 30 hours a week, and they say they work 40 hours and doctor the documents that look like they work 40 hours. Occupancy fraud, that is, maybe they're buying a second house and they're going to use it for an investment purposes, but they want a better rate, so they claim that it's going to be a second house and not an investment property. That's occupancy fraud. Liability fraud, again, this is all about making their net worth look better, so maybe they're not declaring all their liabilities. And again, it's all about this person, this applicant wants a specific property that they wouldn't qualify for, and so they're being fraudulent in order to obtain that property. It's all about the house. A second type of fraud is called fraud for profit. It's motivated by a desire to improperly acquire mortgage loan proceeds for personal gain. This type of fraud, it's all about the money. And this type of fraud is much more devious. All fraud is looked on the same from the BSA standpoint, but this fraud, 80% of the losses in the mortgage industry through fraud is lost through this type of fraud, fraud for profit. It's also known as insider fraud because it usually takes people on the inside, or at least people who have a good understanding of the mortgage industry, to perpetrate this kind of fraud. It may be an LO working with an appraiser who's also working with a real estate agent, and they come up with a scheme to get rich by committing fraud. And it involves multiple misrepresentations and omissions. It involves valuation fraud, overvaluing the property, and also could involve fabricated repairs and upgrades. But this fraud, again, is all about the money. In fraud for property, the person, they want the house, they want to be able to pay for the house, they want to stay in the house. Once they get the house, they may not be able to do that, and they may end up in foreclosure. But if they end up in foreclosure, at least the collateral is still there. But in fraud for profit, they're overvaluing the property, and many times the collateral is not there, and the investor loses big time. Here's an example. This property was used in a fraud for property scheme. I didn't make these pictures up. I pulled these pictures off of the FBI's website, and this was an actual property. I'm not sure where it is located, but this was an actual property used in a fraud for profit scheme transaction. Here you can see the house. It looks like a normal house. It supposedly had some upgrades done to it, but if you look at the true picture that was hidden through fraud, the back of the house, you can see that the upgrades weren't all that great on this house. And you can see that in this case, the investor, the collateral is not there, and the investor is going to lose big time on this. That is fraud for profit scheme. Another type of fraud is called fraud for criminal enterprise. This is motivated by a desire to launder money through real estate transactions. This involves organized criminals who use the mortgage industry to launder money. It involves straw borrowers many times. It involves lots of property flipping. A criminal has a lot of cash. They use real estate because those are high value assets that they can put a lot of money into. So somebody in organized crime buys a property, say they pay $200,000 for it, they keep it for a little while, maybe even rent it out for a little while, turn around, sell it, and say they even sell it for only $200,000. They didn't make any money off of it, but that $200,000 that they now have is a lot cleaner than the $200,000 they put into it. So the organized criminals will use the mortgage industry in order to launder money, fraud for criminal enterprise. So the Bank Secrecy Act. What is required? What exactly does the Bank Secrecy Act require from Mid-America Mortgage as a company? And also specifically, I'm sure you're asking on this call what they got to do with me and what's required of me. So there's two things. Number one, the thing required is a written AML program. And the second thing required is the reporting of suspicious activity, all those crimes we talked about, the reporting of suspicious activity to FinCEN by the filing of suspicious activity reports, also known as SARs. The compliance department actually files the SARs, but the suspicious activity reporting is the responsibility of all employees at Mid-America Mortgage. So let's look at these two things. The first one is the AML program. A compliant AML program will have 4 pillars, or what they call pillars, and we'll look at those. The first pillar is we have to have an AML officer. And here at Mid-America Mortgage, that AML officer is currently Carol Lampier, and she administers the AML program with the aid of the compliance department. The second pillar, internal controls, that is the written policies and procedures, and those can be found on Mortgage Machine. The third pillar is external testing. We do a risk-based assessment annually, and it also includes an external program review. We have an outside audit every year that audits the AML program. And the fourth pillar is training, and that is what we're doing here today. But where the rubber meets the road on any AML program is the reporting of suspicious activities, and that's where everybody comes in. As you're going through your daily routine, whatever your job title is, whatever your duties are in the company, if you see anything suspicious that looks like any criminal activity might be involved or just doesn't look right, we're required by the BSA to report those things. So how do we know? When is suspicious activity required to be reported? Anytime you suspect that there may be fraud or some other type of crime being perpetrated by a borrower, an employee, a service provider, or any party, basically any party involved in any way with Mid-America Mortgage's business transactions. If we suspect something's going on with any part of that, it needs to be reported. So again, as I'm going through my day, how do I know? Sometimes it's pretty obvious. If you're looking at loan documents and they're obviously fraudulent, or for some reason you know they're obviously fraudulent, or maybe somebody's using two Social Security numbers, something obvious like that, absolutely, there's a no-brainer. You report those things. But sometimes it's not so obvious. You don't know. You're not quite sure. You just have a bad feeling about something. But just using your common sense and just using your experience and just using your knowledge of the industry and your gut feeling, you just think, it's something, I don't exactly know, but just something's not right here. Something doesn't seem right. Something isn't adding up. And maybe you ask a few more questions and still you can't reconcile that feeling that something's not right. That's when you need to report it go ahead and report it to the compliance company. If it's obvious, the compliance department, if it's obviously something going on, report it. But if you just have this feeling like, what, something just ain't right here, go ahead and report that. Because we would rather you report something than not to report something. We're talking about red flags here. A red flag is a warning signal of possible danger, or in this case, a warning signal of possible fraud or something going on. A red flag does not mean that there is fraud, but it's simply a warning that you need to be alert. Doesn't mean something is wrong. It just means, hey, I need to raise my awareness level here a little bit. Red flags. By law, we are required to go over red flags. There are literally dozens of different red flags. If you look on Fannie Mae, they list literally dozens for each process in the mortgage transaction. But we're just going to look at some of the more common ones here. Borrower-related red flags, suspicious identification documents. That's pretty self-explanatory. Shock or lack of interest in the term of the loan. If someone is shocked when you give them the terms, I mean, a lot of times we're all shocked when we're given the terms, but if they're really shocked, that may be a red flag. Not necessarily, but could be a red flag that they might be overestimating their income, or they're committing some kind of fraud for property when they get the initial shock of what their terms really are. On the flip side of that, a lack of interest in the terms of the loan. If somebody doesn't really care about the terms, they're not trying to get better terms, and they don't seem to really care, that could be a red flag of maybe this is a straw borrower and there's really somebody else behind this loan. Reluctance to provide information regarding business holdings. If they're claiming business income as part of their application and they're reluctant to talk about their business, or they're being kind of evasive about whatever, that could be a red flag of maybe there's something going on here. Income-related red flags. Income appears to be out of line with the type of employment, age, education, lifestyle. If they list their job and the income for that job is much, much more than what would normally be for that type of job, that could be a red flag. Not necessarily, but could be something you at least want to raise your awareness of. Inconsistency in stated income, bank statements, filings, other documentation. If you're looking at documents and their income says one thing, but their bank deposits are much greater, and you can't reconcile that difference, that's a red flag. There could be something going on there. Business income is inconsistent with the applicant's business. Say they own a small mom and pop restaurant, but the deposits for that mom and pop restaurant are just thousands and thousands of dollars, much more than what you would think a small business would bring in. That could be a red flag that maybe some of that income is coming from a different source and they're laundering it through this business. Asset related, large deposits, lots of wire activity, multiple accounts with multiple transactions. That sounds exactly like what we talked about in layering with money laundering. Applicant savings are inconsistent with his income. It's a lot more money in the bank than his income is. Again, to be perfectly legitimate, but it is a red flag. Applicant does not utilize traditional banking institutions. Finally, occupancy-related red flags. Unrealistic commute from subject property to employment. Again, nowadays there's all kinds of telecommuting and different kinds of commuting. But if someone's buying a house and it's 300 miles away from their job, and you know they don't telecommute, you know they go to their job every day, then that definitely might be a red flag that maybe this isn't going to be an owner-occupied property. This might be an investment property. Unrealistic distance from current residence to subject property second home. That is, they're buying a home, they're claiming it's a second home, but it's in the same city, or it's in the same neighborhood, or it's in close proximity. That's a red flag of, hey, maybe this isn't really a second home. This is a house they're buying for investment purposes, and they're trying to get a better rate. Downgrading to a smaller or less expensive home, yet retaining current residence. A lot of people are doing this nowadays, but that could be a red flag of occupancy-related fraud. So, what, as an employee of Mid-America Mortgage, what are you supposed to do and as far as the BSA is concerned? So here's a to-do list. Number 1, understand and comply with BSA AML laws and MAM's AML policies and procedures. That's what this training is for. Number 2, be alert to unusual or suspicious activity. That's the red flag. Just in your daily routines, don't be a detective. We're not asking you to be Sherlock Holmes, but we're just asking you that in your daily routine, just use common sense, use your experience, and use your gut feeling, and pay attention to any red flags that pop up. Number 3, immediately report any suspicious activity, and you will report that to the compliance department. What not to do, things not to do, don't determine if it's worth reporting. If you think something's wrong or you know something's wrong, report it. Don't try to determine, well, it's not that bad, he's just overestimating his income or maybe or whatever. Just don't try to determine the worth of it. Just report it. Number 2, don't willfully turn a blind eye. You have a suspicion, but it's not my job, it's not my department, I don't want to get involved, whatever. Don't willfully turn a blind eye. It is required by the law to report these things. Don't wait to report. Once something comes to light, we have a certain time frame that we have to report this to FinCEN. We have a specific time frame that we have to file an official SAR if we're going to do that with FinCEN. And so please, if you suspect something, report it right away. Don't wait, because as soon as you find out, as soon as you suspect it, the clock starts ticking, and we have a specific time frame that we have to stay in to remain compliant. Don't talk to any of the parties involved about reporting. This FinCEN and the BSA and the filing of SARs is a very confidential process, and there are penalties for non-confidentiality, so don't talk to anybody, especially the party involved. Don't warn somebody, hey, we're going to file a SAR on you or whatever. Just don't talk to any parties involved about reporting. And the last thing, don't be afraid to report. You're not going to get in trouble even if you report something and it turns out to be nothing. We would rather you report something that turns out to be nothing than to report nothing that turns out to be something in the end and ends up biting the company and even possibly yourself. So don't be afraid to report. If you want to remain anonymous, you can do that, but just anything suspicious, please report it. Compliance. What will compliance do? Compliance will gather the information. If we need additional information, we may come back to you for additional information, but we're going to gather the information and determine if a SAR needs to be filed. Sometimes after additional information is gathered, it comes to light that, hey, this is nothing, and we don't need to file a SAR. Other times we'll need to file a SAR. But compliance will determine that. The third thing compliance will do is that they will communicate with you as how to proceed. If say this has involved a loan, we will communicate to you very quickly. Go ahead and proceed with this loan, or hold off a bit, or we will tell you, this needs to be denied. But we will very quickly tell you how to proceed with that. What we won't do is that we won't retaliate or discipline. Again, like I said earlier, we'd rather you report something that's nothing than nothing that turns out to be something. So we won't retaliate or discipline you in any way. We will not report, but we also won't report back to you as the result. If you contact us with something suspicious, we may get back for you for additional information, but we won't get back with you and tell you what happened, what the result. We won't tell you if we filed a SAR or if we didn't. In fact, once we file a SAR, FinCEN doesn't even tell us what the result is. They don't tell us if they're investigating the person or not. They may come back to us for additional information, but they won't tell us the result. It's highly confidential, so we'll get back to you for additional information, but we won't get back to you about what we did. So the process of reporting suspicious activity, very simple. If you suspect something, report it to compliance as soon as possible. You can email Kara, directly at karalampier@midamericanmortgage.com, or you can email the compliance department in general, compliance@midamericanmortgage.com. If you don't want to email it, if you'd rather call us, you can do that. But when you contact us, give us as much information as possible. If it involves a loan, the loan number. If it involves the date that the issue came to light, and a description. Sometimes you'll have documentation. Sometimes you won't have anything other than just a hunch or a concern. But just contact us. Give us as much information as possible. Don't not contact us. Just go ahead and contact us. Give us information, and your job is done. And we'll take it from there. Here's the part we have to cover this too. Penalties for noncompliance. Willful violations of the BSA requirements may result in both civil and criminal penalties. So please, if you suspect something, just report it and you'll be okay. So with that, if there's any questions, let me check question queue real quick. I don't see anything in there. So with that, that concludes this anti-money laundering training. Just thank you for your participation and have a great day.